I'm going to show you how to remove a crank today. So this is good in case you ever need to take the crank off to access the bottom bracket, to adjust it or replace it, or even just to replace the crank. So the first step is just to pop this dust cover off. The dust cover will often come off with a flat screwdriver or maybe an Allen key or a small awl, something else to get it in there and pop it off. Sometimes they're threaded, but they're always a little bit different on all bikes. Next, we're going to use a socket wrench to remove this crank bolt here. So this is a regularly threaded bolt, so we're just going to go lefty-loosey, pop that loose, and usually after a couple times around I can just remove it with my hand. Now that we have the crank bolt out, we're going to use our crank puller. It's a pretty cool tool. It consists of two parts. So the first part, we're going to thread this into the crank. So we've got some threads in there. And after we get this all inside the crank, we're going to start driving this next part in. And this is going to push up against in there, and the crank's going to slide off into our hands. So the most important part before we get started is to make sure that you've got some grease on the threads there. So we want to make sure that this tool goes all the way in, but then once the crank comes off, we want to be able to back the tool out. The last thing we want is to get our crank off and then have our tool stuck in that crank. So I put some grease on there, and I'm just going to start driving this in with my hand. Now our goal is to get as many of the threads of the crank puller into the crank as possible. You can usually go most of the way with your hand, but eventually we'll have to switch to a wrench just to get it nice and tight. All right, I'm going to tighten this down, and then I'm going to start driving in the second part of this tool. Usually it gets tougher before it gets easier. Once it starts to get easier, you know you're close to the crank popping right off. All right, and I can feel it starting to get wobbly, and off comes the crank in our hands. I'm going to use this wrench again to loosen this up, just pop it off. And then I can take it out the rest of the way with my hand. Now I'm going to show you how to put the crank back on. So maybe you took the crank off, you want to replace it, or you just needed to do some work to the bottom bracket, but now you're ready to put it back on. So when you put the crank back on, the first thing you want to make sure is that you have your chain around your chain ring, or else you'll have to take the crank back off to put it on again. And the next thing you want to make sure is that you get this crank on 180 degrees opposite your other crank. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard to pedal your bike once you get it all set up. Last thing is we're just going to thread this crank bolt back in. I'm going to do it by hand at first and then tighten it down with that socket wrench that we used to take it off. All right, once I get this crank bolt nice and tight, we're all good to go.